Have you ever sat in church feeling like something was off? Like worship had become more of a performance than a genuine encounter with God? I was there when it happened, standing on stage leading worship, when I looked out at the congregation and realized they weren't worshiping. They were just watching. That moment changed everything for me. After 15 years as a worship leader across multiple churches, I've witnessed both the beauty and the struggles of leading worship. And today, I'm pulling back the curtain on 7 shocking things worship leaders need to stop doing immediately. What I'm about to share might ruffle some feathers, but sometimes the truth needs to be spoken. And if you've ever felt disconnected during worship, you're about to discover why. But stay with me until the end, because I'll also share the one unexpected change that completely transformed our church's worship experience, something most leaders never consider. 1. Making worship all about you. Worship is not about you. Yet walk into many churches today, and what do you see? Worship leaders performing like they're auditioning for American Idol. Picture this. The lights dim, the music builds, and suddenly the worship leader launches into vocal runs so complicated that the congregation just stands there, completely lost. I've seen it happen. I've been that worship leader. But here's the harsh reality. When you're showing off your vocal skills rather than leading people to God, you're not a worship leader. You're a performer. I remember one Sunday when a guest worship leader came to our church. His vocal talent was incredible, hitting notes I didn't even know existed. The band was flawless. The production was perfect. But after service, I overheard an elderly woman say, "I couldn't sing along with any of it. I just stood there feeling inadequate." That's the opposite of what worship should do. Worship should invite people in, not leave them feeling like spectators at a concert. True worship leadership isn't about having the most impressive voice. It's about having a heart that's focused on creating an atmosphere where people can genuinely encounter God. Ask yourself this question. If the microphone was taken away, would you still lead with the same passion? If your answer hesitates even for a second, it might be time to check your heart. 2. Singing songs that teach false theology. Now this next point might shock you, but it needs to be said. Every song you sing shapes what people believe about God. Think about it. Your congregation doesn't just hear these songs on Sunday, they sing them throughout the week. These lyrics sink deep into their hearts and minds, forming their understanding of who God is. Here's the problem. Some of today's most popular worship songs contain lyrics that simply aren't biblically accurate. For example, one well-known song includes the line, "And as you speak, 100 billion creatures catch your breath, evolving in pursuit of what you said." It sounds beautiful until you realize it's suggesting creation evolved rather than being spoken into existence by God. That's not what Scripture teaches. Another song says, "You didn't want heaven without us, so Jesus, you brought heaven down." But is that really why Jesus came? Because he was lonely in heaven? Absolutely not. I once spoke with a young believer who told me, "I believe God created the universe because he was lonely and needed us." When I asked where she got that idea, she immediately referenced a popular worship song. This is the power and danger of what we sing. Scripture tells us we will be held accountable for what we teach. James 3 verse 1. And as worship leaders, we teach through music. If a song sounds amazing but teaches bad theology, you have 2 choices. Rewrite the lyrics or leave it out. Period. And this isn't about being the worship police. It's about caring deeply enough about people's understanding of God that we evaluate everything we put on their lips. 3. Leading shallow worship experiences. I call them 7-11 songs. The same 7 words repeated 11 times. You know the ones I'm talking about. Now, repetition isn't always bad. Even Scripture repeats, "Holy, holy, holy." But there's a difference between meaningful repetition and empty phrases. When was the last time you asked, does this song actually say something meaningful about who God is? Does it have depth? I once led a worship set that consisted entirely of the newest, catchiest songs. The energy was high. People were moving. But afterward, a longtime church member approached me and asked, "Where was Jesus in any of that?" I was speechless. The songs had great melodies, but they barely mentioned the gospel, the cross, or the specific character of God. And while we're talking about song selection, just because you love a song doesn't mean it's right for your congregation. If people are too focused on learning new lyrics, they can't fully engage in worship. And before we continue, I should mention that there's one mistake even the best worship leaders still make. And we'll get to that shocking revelation shortly. It completely changed how I approach worship leadership. Think about the elderly woman in your congregation who's been faithfully attending for decades. Can she connect with the song you've chosen? What about the new believer who doesn't know all the Christian terminology yet? Or the teenager trying to find authentic faith? Because worship isn't about staying trendy. It's about leading everyone into God's presence. What if we prioritize songs that help people truly experience God, rather than just keeping up with the latest worship hits? What if we carefully crafted set lists that contain both depth and accessibility? 4. Being completely predictable. Let me guess how worship goes at your church. 2 fast songs to start, lights dim, 1 mid-tempo song, slow ballad, prayer. Announcement time. Am I close? Thought so. But here's what's fascinating. God is wildly unpredictable, yet our worship has become entirely formulaic. We've traded divine encounters for comfortable routines. I remember visiting a church where the worship leader completely broke the pattern. He started with a moment of silence. No introduction, no welcome, just silence. For 60 uncomfortable seconds, people fidgeted in their seats. Then he simply said, "Sometimes we need to quiet ourselves before we can truly hear God speak." The worship that followed was among the most genuine I've ever experienced. Why? Because the pattern interruption woke everyone up to the presence of God in a fresh way. What would happen if you completely broke the script? What if worship didn't always follow the same pattern? Start with scripture reading instead of a song. Begin with a moment of silence. Try an a cappella section in the middle of service. Incorporate a testimony between songs. Pause for reflection after a powerful lyric. Use a responsive reading from scripture. By breaking predictable patterns, you create moments of surprise that wake people up to God's presence in fresh ways. Because the truth is, when people can predict exactly what's coming next, their minds wander and their hearts disengage. And that brings us to something even more concerning. 5. Commanding rather than inviting. Everyone stand up. If you love Jesus, raise your hands high. Come on, church, make some noise. Sound familiar? I've said those exact words from stage. But here's the uncomfortable truth I had to face. That's not leadership, it's manipulation. When you command people to worship in specific ways, you're not creating space for authentic connection with God. You're creating social pressure. Think about the person who walked in after just receiving a cancer diagnosis. Or the couple sitting in silence after a miscarriage. Or the teenager questioning their faith. Do they need to be commanded to stand up and shout for joy? Or do they need permission to meet God exactly where they are? One Sunday, I noticed a man sitting quietly during an upbeat praise song when everyone else was standing. My first instinct was to call him out, to encourage him to stand with us. After service, I learned his wife had left him that week, and he was simply trying to hold it together. In that moment, sitting quietly was his worship. Who am I to dictate how someone should express their heart to God? Instead of commanding, try inviting. As we sing this next song, you're welcome to stand, kneel, or sit. However you feel led to respond to God in this moment is perfect. True worship leadership creates freedom, not conformity. It invites rather than demands. It makes space for the broken, the questioning, and the hurting to encounter God authentically. And speaking of true leadership, 6. Just singing instead of actually leading. There's a world of difference between being a singer and being a worship leader, yet many have confused the two. People walk into church carrying heavy burdens. Some feel distant from God. Others are wrestling with doubt or guilt. If all you do is sing lyrics without helping them connect to what those words mean, you're missing the entire point of worship leadership. Take a song like Your Love Never Fails, It Never Gives Up. It never runs out on me. Instead of just singing through it, pause and say, some of you came in today feeling like you've fallen too far for God to love you anymore. But this song reminds us that His love never fails. It never gives up, even when we do. Now, people aren't just singing words. They're experiencing truth that speaks directly to their situation. I learned this lesson when a young woman approached me after service in tears. She said, "When you explained what that song meant before we sang it, about God's love being greater than our failures, it was like you were speaking directly to me. I needed to hear that today." All I had done was take 15 seconds to connect the lyrics to real life. But those 15 seconds transformed the song from pleasant music into a life-giving message. Your job isn't just to hit the right notes. It's to build bridges between God's truth and people's lives. That's what makes you a worship leader, not just a worship singer. Try these simple approaches. Share a brief scripture that connects to the song's theme. Offer a 10-second personal testimony related to the lyrics. Explain a challenging word or concept within the song. Draw attention to a particularly meaningful line before singing it. When you help people understand what they're singing and why it matters, you transform singing into worship. 7. Quenching the spirit with rigid schedules. We need to wrap this up. We're running behind schedule. How many powerful worship moments have been cut short because of those words? I understand the practical realities of church schedules, multiple services, and time constraints, but when we prioritize our programs over God's presence, we've missed the heart of worship entirely. I once attended a service where the congregation was in a powerful moment of worship. You could feel the presence of God in a tangible way, but the worship leader abruptly ended it because they were 3 minutes behind schedule. The spiritual momentum was completely lost, and what could have been a life-changing encounter became just another Sunday service. What would happen if we created space for God to move in unexpected ways? What if we allowed a song to continue when people are clearly connecting with God, even if it means going off script? This doesn't mean we throw structure out the window. It means we hold our plans loosely enough that God can redirect them if He chooses. The most powerful worship moments I've experienced weren't meticulously planned. They happened when leaders were sensitive enough to the Spirit to know when to wait, when to continue, and when to simply be silent. Because sometimes the most powerful part of worship isn't what we do, it's what we allow God to do through us. Here's what many worship leaders don't realize. Worship isn't ultimately about the songs we sing or how well we sing them. It's about creating space for people to encounter the living God. And that means sometimes we need to get out of the way. I remember leading worship one Sunday when everything went wrong technically. My in-ear monitors failed, the drummer lost his click track. We couldn't hear each other properly. By all production standards, it was a disaster. Yet after service, person after person commented on how powerful the worship was. Why? Because in the midst of our technical chaos, we stopped relying on our polished performance and simply focused on connecting with God. And people felt the authenticity of that moment. And here's the unexpected twist I promised. The most transformative change in our worship came when we stopped trying to be impressive and started being intentionally vulnerable. One Sunday, I shared a 30-second story of my own struggle with doubt before leading a song about God's faithfulness. The atmosphere in the room completely shifted. People weren't just singing, they were experiencing healing. That moment taught me that authentic leadership, showing our own journey with God, struggles and all, creates space for others to be authentic too. It was the most profound worship service I've ever been part of. If you're a worship leader, I'm challenging you to examine your heart and your habits. Which of these 7 areas do you need to address? And if you're not a worship leader, share this video with someone who is, because when worship is done with the right heart and approach, it becomes one of the most powerful forces for transformation in our churches. What's been your experience with worship? Have you noticed any of these issues in your church? Drop a comment below. I want to hear your thoughts on this. If you found this helpful, don't forget to subscribe for more content on how we can make our churches healthier and more effective at reaching people with the life-changing message of Jesus. If we get worship wrong, we miss one of the most powerful ways people can connect with God. So let's do this right. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, especially if that someone is on your worship team. Until next time, remember, True worship isn't about performance, it's about presence, His presence.